So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Foreign Service Institute's Mabini Dialogue. My name is Uriel Galase, and I will be your host for this afternoon's event. Today, we are privileged to have two very special guests, the Ambassador of Sweden to the Philippines, Ambassador Harold Fries, and former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Delia Domingo Albert. Allow me to introduce first our main speaker. His Excellency Ambassador Harold Fries is the Ambassador of Sweden to the Philippines. Prior to serving as Ambassador, he served as Director, Deputy Head of the EU Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the Minister of the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the UN in New York. This is his second tour of duty in Manila, having previously served at the Embassy of Sweden in Manila from 1991 to 1995. An economist by training, Ambassador Fries received his Bachelor of Arts from the Stockholm School of Economics in 1979 and his Master of Arts in Economics from the University of Southern California in 1981. Ladies and gentlemen, let us please welcome Ambassador Harold Fries.
Thank you for that introduction, Uriel. Should I use this microphone also, or do you know? Well, I'll speak to this one. I'll also say good afternoon to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to see you all here. And I'm delighted that Ambassador Delia Albert is joining us for this event. Ambassador Albert is an inspiration to me, and I think to all of us who are engaged in international affairs, and in particular those of us who attach great importance to the attainment of gender equality. And I'm honored to be invited by the Foreign Service Institute to be a speaker in the Mabini Dialogue series. And I think it's quite fitting to give my speech on feminist foreign policy in the Carlos P. Romulo Library. I don't know if General Romulo was a feminist, but he was a staunch human rights defender, and not the least he, as most of you I'm sure know, he was one of the architects behind the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was adopted in Paris by the UN General Assembly 70 years ago this year. And I think that's an anniversary worth celebrating this year. And it's also fitting to speak on this topic in this month, since March is the International Women's Month. And speaking about International Women's Month, we had the International Women's Day on March 8th, and as a warm-up to my presentation, we will show you a little video clip from a message from the Embassy of Sweden on the International Women's Day. Let's see if it works.
Sweden is the first country in the world with a feminist foreign policy which promotes, supports the rights, representation and resources of women and girls. Gender equality is a prerequisite for achieving the overarching goals of peace, sustainable development and economic growth. Today we pay tribute to the importance of this advocacy. Happy International Women's Day.
Seriously at the embassies in Sweden here in Manila, and we're happy doing it. I should mention that when I looked around this beautiful library that I saw on the walls here, two former lady ambassadors to Sweden One was Ambassador Basilio, and the other one who has just, I think, arrived to Oslo to become the new Philippine ambassador to Sweden, Ambassador Garcia. Just a few words on the Embassy of Sweden before I get into my main topic. I arrived to the Philippines a year and a half ago as the newly appointed Swedish ambassador to the Philippines. And we, at that time, hadn't had an ambassador here, resident ambassador, for 8 years because Sweden closed its embassy in Manila in 2008 for financial reasons. But a few years ago, it was an easy decision for the Swedish government to reopen the embassy. So my first main task when I came here a year and a half ago was to set up the new embassy. And a few months later, on 1st of December 2016, we opened the door to the public. And the main tasks of my embassy is to deal with trade and investment promotion, have a political dialogue with the Philippine government and with other parts of the society, to provide consular services, of course, and to promote important advocacies of the Swedish government, and very much so is the promotion of the Sustainable Development Goals, and gender equality is, of course, an important element of those goals. Now let me go to the main topic of my presentation, the Swedish feminist foreign policy. We like to say that we are the first country with with a feminist foreign policy. We may still be the only one, although I read and hear that Canada is starting to call their government a feminist government and their foreign policy a feminist foreign policy, which is very nice. And we would, of course, like to see many other countries that brand their foreign policy feminist foreign policy. But actually, Sweden's feminist foreign policy is one element of Sweden's feminist government. Directly upon winning the election in 2014 and assuming his office, the new Prime Minister declared that his government would be a feminist government. And the new Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, quickly followed suit and announced that she would lead a feminist foreign policy. And I will focus my speech on this feminist foreign policy. But before getting there, I will briefly dwell on why my government decided to stand out as a feminist government. That decision was based on the realization that the high levels of growth and employment that Sweden had enjoyed for a long time had been achieved to a considerable extent thanks to progress made towards gender equality. The progress towards gender equality in Sweden has not happened by itself. It is largely a result of political struggle and decisions, together with pressure from civil society. Key government decisions in the past to promote gender equality have introduced separate income taxation for wife and husband in 1971. In other words, before that, the wife and husband salaries were put on top of each other and were then taxed at a higher tax rate because Sweden has a very high progressive tax system. But now splitting the two incomes, then the total tax that the household was paying became much lower, and that became an incentive for women to work. In 1974, we decided to have an equal division of parental leave. And in 1974 also, an affordable child care was set up. And this is just to name a few of these important political decisions that have promoted gender equality in Sweden. And I will come back to more later. A more recent example of a government initiative to help achieving gender equality in Sweden was the establishment in January this year of a gender equality agency, which will contribute through analysis, coordination and support to an effective implementation of the government's gender equality policy. Despite progress made, many challenges remain. Women and men, girls and boys, still do not have access to resources and power on equal terms, not in Sweden and not internationally. That is why Sweden has a feminist government and a feminist foreign policy. I'm not saying that Sweden is the only country that gives high priority to work on gender equality. Absolutely not. There are many like-minded countries that have similar policies and action plans. But one should not underestimate the effect of branding itself as a feminist government with a feminist foreign policy. It gives a clear signal to all government employees that the attainment of gender equality is of highest priority in all government work. It also puts the government on the spot for scrutiny. The government has to show that it lives up to the promise of being a feminist government. The government is accountable for results in gender equality and for lack of results. Now, before going more into detail into Sweden's feminist foreign policy, I will comment a little bit on the situation of gender equality globally in Sweden and in the Philippines. I think everyone agrees that gender equality has improved over the years. Even if the gender gap actually increased in 2017, according to World Economic Forum in its annual report on the global gender gap. Let's hope that that was a blip in the development and not a new trend. Just a few examples of where globally gender equality has improved over the years. One is that gender disparity in education has been eliminated. Another one is that women in parliaments doubled in 20 years, but now it's still only 20% on average. And I think in the Philippines it's close, I think the share of women in the House of Representatives is close to 30%, if I'm not misinformed. And when we look at Sweden and the Philippines, you'll see a graph or a slide here soon. Okay, it's warming up. The slide is showing the most recent ranking by World Economic Forum of the 10 countries, the 10 top-ranked countries when it comes to global gender gap. And when you see this ranking, you will see that both Sweden and the Philippines are in the top 10. So this is a ranking that is, of course, is very nice to show here when we speak about gender equality. It's a testament that both Sweden and the Philippines are doing quite well internationally in terms of gender equality. I will give some more examples of how gender equality is doing in Sweden, since I know more about it, and I think you might be more interested in that than about your own country, since you know that better than I do. So in Sweden, you will see a timeline here which shows important political decisions in Sweden promoting gender equality. And I will walk out, since I can't see the the slide myself, but then I lose the microphone. Ah, there we go. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. And you probably can't see the text there, so that's why I will tell you what this is about. In 1842, there was a school reform which allowed girls to be educated, which sounds strange today, but it was obviously necessary at that time. In 1919, all women gained the right to vote in Sweden, quite late actually internationally. In 1938, birth control and abortion were legalized. In 1974, parental leave replaced maternity leave, which meant that before 1974, only mothers were allowed to take a leave after birth. But in 1974, the fathers had the equal right as the mothers. And I can mention also that this paternity leave law was strengthened in 2002 when the number of days for parental leave was increased to 480 days, 480 working days. So if you translate that into years, that I think that makes it one and a half, more than 1.5 years. No, 2.5 years. The parents can share to be home with their newborns. And in 2016, this law was updated so that 3 months of these 480 days are reserved for each parent, which means if, let's say that the father doesn't take any parental leave, then the mother cannot take all the 480 days, but only 390 days. So this is an incentive for fathers to stay home with their newborns. I think from what the most recent figures is that 90% of Swedish fathers take parental leave. And I was one of them, but many years ago. I stayed home for 6 months with our 2 boys, and I like to say that that was the best period I've had so far in the Foreign Service. We have a nice little video clip to show real-life Swedish dads staying home with their children.
When I was home with my son Diego. The project started when I was home with my son Diego. I realized that I couldn't find much information or inspiration for me as a father. I heard about this study. They were asking children who they were going to if they were seeking comfort. The first choice was the mother. Not until the 5th place came the father. That was actually after the alternative of not going to anyone at all. In Sweden, families has 480 days in total of parental leave. I was shocked because when I saw to the numbers, there were only 14% that actually shared the days equally. So I started this project to explain the benefits of being home and taking full responsibility of the household. And also be a part of your children's emotional space. This is something that women have done without any recognition. I wanted to plant a seed to dads around the world. What impact it would mean for yourself and for your child, and actually for your relationship, if you would stay at home with your children for a long period of time. It is not about creating superheroes. It is about creating role models that we all can actually relate to.
Okay, just that was a little insight into modern life in Sweden today. More comments on the timeline of important political decisions that have promoted gender equality. In 1975, we legalized abortion until 18th week of pregnancy. And in 1999, the very important new prostitution law was adopted, which criminalizes the sex buyer, not the seller. And this was a first in the world that criminalizes the buyer and not the seller. So the person selling sex is never punished in Sweden. And 10 years after this law came into effect, street prostitution had been halved in those 10 years. And a few other aspects of progress towards gender equality in Sweden. In 1970s, there was a law that declared that all local governments had to provide high-quality child care for all 1 to 5 year olds in Sweden. And this meant, of course, that it provided opportunities for mothers to go back to their work careers earlier than before. And this has been one of the main reasons why so many women are working in Sweden compared to most other countries. 44% of the parliament, the share of women in the parliament is 44%. It actually decreased in the last election from 47%, but we're pretty close to 50%. And half of our cabinet in Sweden are women. And 72% of women in Sweden are part of the labor force compared to 76% of men. So almost the same share of women as men in the Swedish labor force. And an interesting statistic is that 45% of Swedish priests are female. And now our Archbishop, the head of the Swedish Church, is a woman since 2014. Now we are mostly Protestants in Sweden, so we have different rules to follow in these aspects. Just a few words on gender equality improvements in the Philippines, and I'll mention just 2 examples. And one is that you're in the process, if I understand it correctly, in increasing the number of maternity leave to 120. I think it went from 60? So that's a great improvement, a doubling. And an interesting information I saw the other day in the newspaper was that in the most recent Philippine Military Academy class 2018, 27% were women, which I thought it surprised me that it was so high, and I think it has increased, I think it's the highest ever, and I think that's very positive. And this year, 3 of the top 10 in the graduating class were women. But then I remember from last year that there was a woman cadet who topped the class of 2017. So obviously women are making inroads also in the military, which is great. So a lot of things are getting better when it comes to gender equality, but much more needs to be done, of course. So I will give some examples globally and in Sweden and in the Philippines. And globally, 1 in 4 women in the age group 20 to 24 years was married before 18. So 1 in 4 was married as a minor. And 1 in 3 women has experienced physical or sexual violence. And all of this are global statistics. And women spend 2.5 times more time on unpaid household work than men. So of course that makes it more difficult for women to maintain a career, and probably it makes women more tired and stressed out. And then we have the Me Too phenomenon. The tsunami of testimonials about sexual harassment and abuse by men in power. And interestingly, as you can see here on the slide, Time magazine that for 2017 named the Me Too Person of the Year. And I now turn to Sweden, where men take only 25% of the parental leave that they can take. So out of those 480 days, only 25% of them are taken by men. And typically we think it should be more or less equal, so there's quite a way to go there. And only 16% of chief executive officers in Swedish companies are women, which means, of course, that the businesses, they lose competence because they don't take advantage of all the competence that exists among all the women, and also that girls in business lack role models. The share of women in boards in listed companies is a bit higher, 33%. But it has increased in Sweden from 20% in just 4 years, and that was, I think, to a large extent thanks to that the government threatened mandatory quotas unless at least 40% of the board members were women by 2020. So the Swedish companies, they have to go from 33% to 40% in just 3 years. Otherwise, the government will introduce mandatory quotas for women in boards. And the Me Too phenomenon has been very strong in Sweden. Tens of thousands of testimonials and hundreds of thousands of posts in social media about sexual harassment and abuse in basically all sectors of the society. And as a result of this, or one result of this, is that the government has presented a bill regarding consent to sexual acts, which means when engaging sexually with another person, it has to be clear that there is mutual consent. So the onus on showing that there was mutual consent has become much stronger now. A few words on the Philippines. Yes, you have doubled your maternal leave from 60 to 120 days, but there is no paternal leave as far as I know. So the maternal leave is valid for 1 week for fathers. Great. That's better than 0. Okay. Thank you for adding to this. So here in the view of my view and I think many others, there is room for improvement in offering also fathers parental leave. 1/3 of all 19-year-old girls in the Philippines are pregnant or have already given birth. to me this means that the reproductive health law really needs to be fully implemented. And in the Philippines, there is no legal abortion and no divorce. And on the issue of divorce, I just saw over the weekend that New York Times picked it up and had an article about the lack of the legal divorce in the Philippines. So if you have a chance, I recommend that you read this article. And I think it's quite amazing that in this country now with so many women at high positions, and also for a long time with 2 presidents as women, that today in the cabinet there's only one, I think it's only one woman cabinet secretary, the tourism secretary, unless I missed someone, but that is my last counting. A final comment on gender equality and what more needs to be done is that I'm quite puzzled why the Me Too phenomenon hasn't really reached the Philippines. I haven't seen much of a reaction that I've seen, well, in my home country, but not only in my country, but in so many other countries, also in other Asian countries. But here it has been quite silent about it, which I would be very interested to hear any comments from you why there hasn't been a similar response in the Philippines as there has been in so many other countries. Now let me turn to Sweden's feminist foreign policy. As I said, it's a first in the world, and the concept was first met with mixed reactions. Some were skeptical, and I was one of them. In describing the response, our Foreign Minister Margot Wallström has quoted Mahatma Gandhi in saying, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win." And she won over me, and she won over, I think, almost all of my colleagues in the Foreign Service. We're now all for working for the feminist foreign policy. So why is our foreign minister pushing a feminist foreign policy? Well, 2 main reasons. The first one is that gender equality is part of universal human rights. Every girl and boy should have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. And the second main reason is that gender equality is not just the right thing to do. It's a prerequisite for achieving other important foreign policy goals on peace, security, and sustainable development. So equality makes really sense. And you will see some very short clips, video clips about this. Okay, if you wonder why you didn't hear anything, it's because there was no sound to these video clips. Now we mobilize the entire Swedish Foreign Service to strengthen the rights, representation and resources, the 3 R's of all women and girls. And when we strengthen the rights of women and girls, we try to ensure full enjoyment of human rights by all women and girls and combat all forms of violence and discrimination. And strengthening representation of women the Swedish Foreign Service strive for equal participation in all decision-making processes, and to recruit more women in international organizations and have more women in peace mediation. The research shows that if there's an equal number of men and women in peace mediation, peace processes contribute to quicker and more lasting peace agreements. And regarding strengthening resources of women, our Foreign Service promote women's legal rights regarding work opportunities, equal pay for equal work, for the equal right to inheritance, and the equal right to land ownership. And Sweden is also applying a gender perspective when we allocate our development aid. And when it comes to the rights of women, I should highlight that sexual and reproductive health and rights is a top priority for Sweden. We co-launched the She Decides movement last year. It has evolved into a global movement for women's and girls' right to decide over their own bodies. Part of this is legalization of abortion. And here Sweden and the Philippines stand on opposite sides. At the annual meeting of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which concluded in New York last Friday, Sweden was aiming at strong language on sexual and reproductive health and rights. But I haven't been able to check the agreed conclusions over the weekend to see if we achieved what we wanted to do in this area. Now, some words on how Sweden is implementing its feminist foreign policy. The Swedish Foreign Service started this process over 3 years ago. 2 months after the launch of the feminist foreign policy, letters were sent from the political leadership to all parts of the Foreign Service, outlining the strategic thinking and inviting everyone from Copenhagen to Kabul to Santiago de Chile to submit their reflections and input. And this was a key step. A policy that had been introduced top-down now became homegrown. Our Minister for Foreign Affairs formulated an action plan for the government's 4-year term of office, 2015 to 2018, partly based on the input from colleagues in the Swedish Foreign Service all over the world. The action plan guides the daily work of the Swedish Foreign Service with its more than 100 departments, embassies, representations and delegations all over the world. And it includes 6 long-term goals. For every year, specific focus areas reflecting the most pressing challenges are established. And every department in the ministry and every Swedish mission abroad are expected to include action points in their annual operation plan in line with the focus areas for that year. And to coordinate the feminist foreign policy and to follow up the implementation of the action plan, the government has appointed a special ambassador for gender equality. The ambassador and her team develop support material, collect and disseminate good practices, and contribute to developing policy, communications, and incentive structures. An important objective of the feminist foreign policy is involving men and boys in the gender equality work. This is about changing stereotypical masculinity norms, which are a root cause of much violence against women. And violence against women is a global pandemic. Also, men have to become more involved in sharing unpaid domestic work and parental leave in order for women to get equal opportunity for a balanced work and family life. And again, I saw this weekend an article in New York Times which dealt with masculine stereotypes, I think one could say, in preschools in Sweden. And the article is worth reading, and it's basically saying that in Sweden we start from more or less 1 year old and try to reduce these stereotypes of boys and girls and men and women in order to achieve gender equality later on. I'll mention now some results of the Swedish feminist foreign policy so far. This policy has been met with great interest globally, mostly with curiosity and political support, like in Canada, and also with strong engagement internally. It has created a cultural shift within our foreign service. Our feminist policy is discussed as naturally and seriously as our security policy, trade policy, and other key policies of the Foreign Service. And we have an increased ownership of our gender equality work. With better understanding and knowledge of the issues, Swedish diplomats have become more confident in being more proactive and in taking own responsibility for action. And it has increased awareness about gender inequality both in Sweden and abroad. More concretely, our efforts through the Swedish feminist foreign policy have contributed to that 20 countries are now drawing up laws and proposals to strengthen gender equality, to hundreds of thousands of women and girls avoiding unsafe abortions and unwanted pregnancies, and that some 90 local communities around the world are abandoning the practice of female genital mutilation. And 65 countries and organizations are making commitments to combat gender-based violence. Other outcomes of the Swedish feminine policies are, for instance, that last year and this year, Sweden is a member of the UN Security Council, and we have made the implementation of the groundbreaking Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security a top priority for the Security Council membership. This resolution was adopted by the Council 18 years ago, but far too often women are still systematically underrepresented in peacemaking processes. Sweden is therefore working actively in the Security Council to ensure that a gender perspective is integrated in all international operations in conflict and post-conflict countries. Another outcome, and connected with the one I just mentioned, is that in 2015, Sweden's foreign minister launched the Swedish Women's Mediation Network. The aim of this network is to promote and support women's participation in sustainable peacemaking processes before, during, and after conflict. Over the past 20 years, only 8% of the mediators in UN-led peace processes have been women. The Women's Mediation Network currently consists of 9 senior female Swedish diplomats with extensive experiences of peace processes, disarmament, international law, humanitarian affairs, development assistance, and other areas of peace building. By 2017, the network had contributed to peace efforts in Afghanistan, Syria, Colombia, Liberia, and Burundi. Another outcome of our feminist foreign policy is that to spread knowledge of the critical role that midwives can play, Sweden launched in 2016 the initiative Midwives for All. Globally, the maternal mortality rate decreased from 385 per 100,000 births in 1990 to 216 in 2015. This was good progress, but far from the Millennium Development Goal number 5, which said that the decrease should be 75% during that time. So much more progress than actually happened. Today, almost 1,000 women and girls worldwide die from childbirth complications each day, and 99% of them are in developing countries. These figures are troubling in themselves, but the fact that the majority of these deaths could be prevented with the help of qualified midwives and doctors makes the situation even more frustrating. Through the initiative Midwives for All, Sweden promotes more and better midwife training, strengthened legislation, and the recognition of the midwife profession in all countries that we have development cooperation with. Further on outcomes of our feminist foreign policy, we have increased our development assistance to organizations focusing on the enjoyment of human rights for women and girls. And we have appointed a special ambassador for combating trafficking in the international arena. So far we think that we can show good results of the feminist foreign policy. Now, what will happen to the feminist foreign policy in Sweden if the current government loses in the upcoming election in September this year? Well, my personal guess is that a new government would most likely continue giving high priority to gender equality, but probably not under the banner of a feminist foreign policy. I will end my presentation with mentioning a few things that the embassies of Sweden here in Manila is doing under the feminist foreign policy. Well, an important task of the embassy is to promote priority values and advocacies of the Swedish government, and one is obviously gender equality. Other advocacies are corporate social responsibility, freedom of speech, and other aspects of human rights. Now, the embassy promotion of gender equality last year, 2017, includes a roundtable we had on Sweden's feminist foreign policy with quite a number of Philippine journalists. And we had a forum which we called Equality Makes Sense. And you will see it on the slide here at the Ateneo last June with the attendance of I think 200-300 students from Ateneo and fantastic speakers from different sectors of the society talking about the benefits of having more women in their respective sector. And we, of course, participated in the Metro Manila Pride March. I think I like this picture, although I wasn't there. I was out of the country at that moment, but next time I'll join Team Sweden at the Pride March. And for 2018, the embassy is engaged in a Swedish project with the objective of providing support to female journalists affected by online threats, harassments, and sexual abuse. And the Philippines is one of the pilot countries in this project. We're also organizing a workshop and forum on empowering women entrepreneurs through technology later in April. And we're partnering here with Business and Profession Women Makati and Google Business Group Philippines. And the last example of what we're doing this year is that we are promoting Philippine participation in the Stockholm Forum on Gender Equality, which takes place later in April. And we're happy that so far we have two very good representatives of gender equality work in the Philippines attending this forum. My final message is that I encourage you to take a look at the exhibit that we have located just outside the doors on the corridor. It's called Pioneering a Feminist Foreign Policy. It highlights 5 women pioneers and role models in Swedish foreign policy. So with that, I conclude my presentation and say tack salamat.
Thank you, Ambassador Fries, for that very enlightening presentation. I especially love the part about Swedish dads because I felt that it really served to break down our traditional notions of gender stereotypes. By the way, just as an aside, the dictionary definition for the word feminism is gender equality. It is merely to believe that men and women are equal. So if you don't consider yourself a feminist, I don't feel like you belong in the 21st century. So anyway, let's move on. So our next speaker who will react to Ambassador Fries' presentation is Ambassador Delia Domingo Albert. Just as another aside, I was in De La Salle University last Friday attending another forum, and Ambassador Albert was giving a speech on a forum entitled, "Do Women Make Better Diplomats?" And I'm pleased to report that Ambassador Albert made a very compelling case that women do indeed make better diplomats. Ambassador Delia Domingo Albert is the first woman career diplomat to become Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Asia. She represented the Philippines in Switzerland, Romania, Hungary, the Federal Republic of Germany, and the Commonwealth of Australia. For her meritorious and exceptional service to the country, she was conferred the Order of Sikatuna, rank of Datu, and was given the title of Bay Arawatun sa Pilipinas for assisting Muslim women in their search for peace and development. She received the Knight's Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit with Star from the Federal Republic of Germany, and the single award to celebrate 70 years of Philippine-Australia relations in 2016 from the Australian government. Ambassador Albert is a member of the advisory board of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin and the Global Summit of Women. She is the founding chair of Business and Professional Women Philippines, Women in Resource Development, and advisor to the Filipina CEO Circle. The Philippine Women's University conferred on her Doctor of Humanities honoris causa for building a gender-fair society. She was also awarded Most Distinguished Alumna of the University of the Philippines in 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give a warm welcome to Ambassador Delia Domingo Albert.
Good afternoon. You got me there. I didn't know I was going to come on stage. But anyway, listening to Harold, I think I cannot agree more as a reactor to what he has said. But perhaps just to give you an idea of the Philippine role in this whole conversation on gender equality. I remember that the Philippines, if you remember Padre Faura, anybody of you know what Padre Faura meant in the past? Nobody does? Oh my gosh. Padre Faura was synonymous to Department of Foreign Affairs. That's where we were nurtured, that's where we started our careers as young diplomats, where the Supreme Court is today. So listening to you, Harold, and thank you so much for sharing so much with us. If you look at the record of the Philippines in the United Nations, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women was first drafted in Padre Faura. That's why I made mention of Padre Faura. Senator Shahani at that time was sitting in the Commission on the Status of Women in Geneva, and I was her assistant. And we thought that to contribute to the dialogue, to contribute to moving what we thought was important for the Philippines and for the women of the world, was to come out with a declaration on the elimination of discrimination against women. And she had prepared for this, and it was our colleague, attorney Falcon, Minerva Jean Falcon, who quickly went, I don't know if we had computers then, perhaps we didn't. At least we had an electric typewriter. Anyway, and she faxed it to us in the meeting in Geneva. And because Senator Shahani was very, very intent to moving this declaration forward, got the support of the Scandinavian women. I remember a Norwegian lady, Helvi Sipila, who really helped us push this through. And one other woman who was the leader of the Russian delegation helped us with it. I remember Senator Shahani, or Undersecretary Shahani then was scolded for getting the support of Russia at that time. So I'm just sharing with you what we, or I at least personally, went through. And it was a very delicate balance that we had to maintain when we presented this declaration on the elimination of discrimination of women. That was one of the first moves that the Commission on the Status of Women tried to do to move forward. At the end of it, we all wanted a convention. But to get to a convention, you had to go through the steps of a declaration, then moving on to the Commission on the Elimination of Discrimination, Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I mention this because that was very helpful to me. Harold, you know why? That was my ammunition when I challenged the Department of Foreign Affairs when they refused to give me permission to marry the man I wanted to marry. Before my time, all the men could marry any woman they wanted, whether they were Russians, French, Indonesian, Israeli. 21 of our main officers were married to foreign women, and they were allowed to do so. So when I decided to marry a non-Filipino, I was told that I would have to offer to resign and request permission to marry. It was a very tricky way to get the department out of a legal issue. So the 2 letters have to be written, 1 letter of requesting permission and the letter of resignation. With the male officers, they said, thank you, your permission is granted. With the women, they said, thank you, your resignation is accepted. Took me 3.5 years, ladies, to fight that battle with the Department of Foreign Affairs. But when it came to a crunch, I said, look, I have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which says that all forms of discrimination will not be allowed if you ratify, and the Philippines has ratified, but another country has not. The United States has not ratified, I don't know why, but of course most of the Scandinavian, or all of the Scandinavian countries have ratified it. So ladies, today you have all the women ambassadors, who are the women with the foreign names? Collinson, Ambassador Tomacek, Ambassador Consul General Fisher, Ambassador, who else? Anyway, it was not an easy task, but thanks to the convention, we made our point. The second comment I'd like to share was the fact that the Philippines is I think, one of the few countries that have a Magna Carta for women. And the Magna Carta for women, and I advise the women here to read it carefully, because it's very well crafted that any form of discrimination could be taken up by you when you feel any sense or any sign of discrimination. So that's a second. And the third point I wanted to share is a very interesting legislation in the Philippines called the Gender Development Law, which enforces, which makes all government offices to appropriate 5% of their total budget to affirmative action on women. So I think these are very crucial pieces of legislation that the Philippines can be very proud of. And last year I was invited by the Pope. 50 people from around the world were invited to have a dialogue with the Pope on the Sustainable Development Goals, and I was surprised that I was asked to do the presentation to the Pope on Agenda number 5. Girls, you must know Agenda number 5 very, very well by heart, because that's another ammunition for you to declare what you think and feel you would suffer in case you are discriminated against. It also gives you a lot of possibilities for affirmative action. So I must have convinced the Pope that women empowerment was important, and surprisingly he invited me again this year. So I'll have a second round with the Pope on the Agenda number 5, which Harold showed to us and shared with us. Finally, I'd like to say that when I met Harold in one of the many functions in Manila, I mentioned that I was very impressed to read about the feminist foreign policy, which I felt, of course, was very, very interesting, the one and only in the world. And I was very curious, and he said, oh, we'll discuss about it over lunch. Of course, I had a terrific excuse to have a good lunch with Harold and his team. And then I said, why don't you share this with the Foreign Service Institute? I feel very strongly that I should give back to the department a lot of the experiences I've had. When I retired, I donated all my 1,800 books to LaSalle Library. And we have been sponsoring a dialogue for our women diplomats to inspire other women in schools in the country. So we started with a very interesting forum called Do Women Make Better Diplomats? To make sure that I don't get shut down, I put a question mark. So, but at the end of the day, you can imagine that the question mark falls down. Last week we had a fascinating one with 5 of your most outstanding women whom we chose because they have retired. And then they would feel more forthright in their speaking out what they felt as women ambassadors. Director Cristobal was there, and I saw him nodding. I never saw him shaking his head, but I think he shook his head because they went over time. This is usually the case when you give a microphone to a woman. She holds on to it for a longer time than she's supposed to. And with that, I'm ready to sit down and perhaps answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Albert, for that very inspirational message. So at this point, I would like to open the floor for any questions from the audience. If you have a question, please kindly approach the microphone, state your name, and state the speaker to whom you wish to address your question. Thank you.
the male officers. I will discriminate.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Price and Ambassador Dili Albert. Thanks for sharing your precious time here at the Department of Foreign Affairs this afternoon. My name is Maria Lourdes Salcedo, and I am the Executive Director for HRMO. So, by way of convincing you that perhaps the Department of Foreign Affairs is one of the government agencies in the Philippines which recognizes the achievements of women in foreign service. Currently, we have about 49% of our officers are female, including more than 20 sitting as heads, ambassadors, and consuls general. As well as if you look at the entire population of personnel in the DFA, the same ratio is applied for personnel rank and file. We also have the same distribution. It's only in the Middle East where you find mostly men compared to women. So we are very lucky and proud to say that we don't specifically target women to come to DFA, but it seems like it's a profession that gives a lot of space for women to shine. Thank you.
May I comment? May I comment on that? Thank you, Odette. Odette, thank you for helping us out with these Women Make Better Diplomats. Next year we will have another round. But when I chaired the Security Council and I chose for my agenda the role of civil society in post-conflict peace building, I had in mind the role of our women, terrific women in Mindanao, who are doing a great job for the peace process in those days. I think one should remember that women had played a role in the peace process in Mindanao, and I hope that our young diplomats could take interest in how you could look at, because you know, foreign policy diplomats, you have to be relevant to what your country needs. And I think that if you look at Marawi, and most of the people who were suffering were women and children. And this is why I thought that we have a women peace table. Unfortunately, it's not being utilized the way it should be. But for you as young diplomats, it's very interesting for you to look at how you as diplomats could be relevant in terms of the needs of the country. And the peace process is a very important part of our assignment, I think, as women diplomats. I remember I was able to put that agenda item forward, and I remember the full support of Kofi Annan when I said, why are you putting this? I said, well, I'm thinking of all the women who suffer in conflicts. So in peace building, I think there should be more effort in bringing in the women, nurturing, caring sense that should come in especially in post-conflict peace building. At that time, I was quite happy to report that 2004, I think 38% of our ambassadors at that time were women. So, and Kofi Annan even commented that in the posts that he had visited, he found a lot of our women, whether it was in Geneva or in New York, very, very active in participating in global conversations.
I'd like to comment also and ask Maria Lourdes on the statistics that you gave on the share of women in different categories in DFA. And if I understood it correctly, it's more or less 50-50 totally for officers. But I didn't understand when it comes to heads of missions. Did you say it's 20% for heads of missions abroad? Or? Okay. Because then it was much better during before. You mentioned 38%.
Yeah, we had our heydays.
And in the Swedish Foreign Service, I would say that today that women are in majority, slightly more than 50%, at mid-level management, but still way below 50% at heads of mission. But I think we're around 40%, which is quite good, but not good enough. And we have difficulty in encouraging, having more senior women diplomats to apply for heads of mission posts. And we think that the main reason is the difficulty of moving with a family and a husband who also has a career to take care of. So we are trying very hard to find ways to make it easier for families to move. For instance, trying to support in job hunting at the post where they would go. Maybe provide jobs at the mission where one of them is going to work. Also, if the spouse cannot find a job, that they are offered financial compensation so that it's not doesn't make the family financial situation deteriorate when they move abroad. But it is, so far it's been difficult to encourage enough senior lady diplomats to apply for top jobs in the Foreign Service, although we know that the competence is there.
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. I am Carol. With Eros, I work in an NGO. It's called Mediators Network for Sustainable Peace. So we're promoting mediation in public disputes. I have a question for Secretary Albert. Given that majority of our OFWs in the Middle East, for example, are women, may I know what have been the steps undertaken by the GFA, probably during the time or maybe now, to address women-specific needs, especially those who are in distress? And the second question for both Ambassador Price and Secretary Albert, has there been a point in your life where your position as promoting gender equality were challenged by those who are not supportive of it? Thank you.
I'm sorry, not by those, challenged by those who?
Not supportive.
On the OFW, I remember when I was Secretary of Foreign Affairs, I visited the Middle East and saw the plight of women who were housed in our embassies because they were running away from their employers. And so we sat down and luckily I suppose you need the Secretary of Foreign Affairs to be there and really see it. And we saw, especially Dubai, Dubai is where a lot of Middle East people bring their families for holidays, and this was an opportunity for the maids to come along. And they find it a place that they could perhaps escape. And so I saw the places where they had to run to the embassy, of course, and the place was really full to the brim, and we did our best to get what we call halfway houses. Halfway houses are very important to be able to house our runaway women workers. In Germany, where I was for quite some time, we had a lot of legal cases of, again, Middle Eastern people who bring their maids to Germany, and when they try to escape, have a difficult time. And we had concluded an informal arrangement with the government at the time, with the Bonn area, for direct help with the host government. Of course, this is very sensitive because of their relationships also with the Middle Eastern countries. But we do a lot. I haven't been to many Middle Eastern posts, but I can say I opened the halfway house in Dubai. I opened the negotiations for cooperation with the German government, and many times it's not us to bring the case against the people who have committed crimes against our people, but we become witnesses, and they become, it's people of Germany versus the human rights violators, which I thought was a very good arrangement, so that it does not politicize the issue and would have a very difficult situation in the Philippines. But I've always been of the opinion that I do not really encourage sending our women abroad for this reason, that it has become a political tool for some countries to use against the Philippines. And we have suffered quite a bit of situations where it becomes very politicized, and we forget that our main purpose there is really to be able to help our people. But I think we're overexposed with I'm very interested to see how Indonesia has stopped sending its women abroad. Considering that if you look at GDP or GNP, they come lower than the Philippines, and yet they are able to hold back their women because they have felt all these years that their women have been abused, and that while there must be some economic gains, I think there's enough reason to believe that we should curtail this as much as possible. And of course, it means creating jobs in the Philippines. And it's for that reason I've done work now after Foreign Service to what I call creating jobs, so that we bring back our people and attract them back here. Because I've seen our foreign policy suffer because of this situation with our overseas workers, when you have to be trading off. And I'm very sensitive to this. And in terms of discrimination, of course, I did suffer for 3.5 years. I postponed getting married just because I had to challenge this highly discriminatory practice in the Department of Foreign Affairs. Now, you girls can marry anybody you want and enjoy your human rights. So perhaps that's why I have my statue in the lobby. Not for any other reason, but for that. So when you pass there, you say, she made it possible for me.
can briefly respond to the question of whether I've been challenged in my general gender equality work. And my spontaneous response is that no, not really. If I look at what I've done in the Swedish Foreign Service and in Sweden, it is so incredibly politically correct in my country to be maybe not a feminist, but be for gender equality, that everyone is at least saying that they support it and are willing to go along with new regulations or rules and so on. So, and here in the Philippines, where the embassy has been working only for a little bit more than a year, and we've been quite active in the area of gender equality, I've only met encouragement and support and a willingness to partner with us in this area. And the Philippines has, as you know, a long tradition in working for gender equality. And Ambassador Albert was describing to us what you did with Senator Shahani. How many years ago was that?
Oh dear. 70s.
Okay, that's 40 years
Early
ago.
70s.
So, and you have a vibrant civil society here, so the possibility of working in this area here in the Philippines, I find is very good. But if there's something negative that comes to my mind, and this is regards my country, is this almost explosion of reactions on the Me Too phenomenon. So obviously in Sweden we have a problem with men in power that take advantage of the women, and these are not few cases, but it's all over the society, and it has surprised many of us, at least many of us men in Sweden, to see this. And this leads me to a question I had actually during my presentation. Why hasn't the Me Too phenomenon reached the Philippines? So I would be very interested to hear any comments from the rest of you. If you have any ideas why it hasn't blown up here.
Anyone? I'm curious too. You know, I just finished 2 or 3 seminars on women in business, and I always felt that perhaps it's not so much a question of gender equality in the Philippines. It's the gap between women who have it all and women who don't have anything at all. And to me, that is the gap that really disturbs me a lot. And that's what I'm trying to be perhaps more conscious about. And that's why I'm doing projects with IP women and women in the farms, etc. But Manila seems to be cut off from a lot of from the rest of the country. If you look at media, if you look at film, if you look at magazines, you'd think you're in a first world. But you step out 2 hours away and you have women who have no water, road, light, etc. To me, that's the greater inequality in the country. That's the bigger gap that we have to address. I'd like to hear from the men. I'd like to hear a male voice from the Department of Foreign Affairs. How they see this issue. What do you think, Harold? And from the women, me too.
Do any of the men have a question? Yes, sir.
Hi, I have a question for Ambassador Fries and Honorable Daniel Albert. For Ambassador Freeze, by the way, I'm Ed. I'm with the Foreign Service Institute. I'm a researcher, and I'm also a member of the Gender and Development Committee in our office in FSI. So for Ambassador Freeze, what do you think were the drivers? What do you think were the drivers that sparked the creation of this feminist foreign policy? And could these drivers be present in the Philippine setting? For Ma'am Albert, I was wondering, how do we address the cultural barriers to gender equality? Because I feel that, especially here in Asia, culture plays a very important role in shaping gender roles. And here in the Philippines, we're very diverse, culturally diverse. And there are certain cultures which have a fixed gender role. So how do you address these cultural barriers?
Okay, thank you, Ed, for your question. And the driver for the Swedish feminist foreign policy and whether there would be fertile ground to have a similar one here. So in the Swedish case, I think there are two main reasons, and I indicated them in my presentation. And one reason that it was taken up by our foreign minister, and why it has been accepted by more or less everyone, is the sense of equal rights. That if you can show that one sex is discriminated against just because of a different sex, then it's easy to convince everyone that that's wrong. So I think that's one basic reason, one basic driver behind this feminist foreign policy. The other one is that we have seen over decades, or probably more than 100 years in Sweden, that by increasing gender equality, so much else has improved in the society. I mean, economic growth, for instance, that when we have increased the participation of women in the workforce from 15% 100 years ago to, I mentioned, I think 72%. So of course that adds incredibly to the economy. And this effect is not happening by itself. It happens thanks to, at least to a large extent, thanks to political decisions, like making sure that you have high-quality daycare, so that women don't have to stay at home for 5-6 years until the child starts school, but after 1 year can leave the child to a good daycare and continue the career. And also these generous rules we have on parental leave also supports the woman in the workplace. And laws about abortion and divorce and many others have helped women contribute more to the society. So that is why we called our forum last year for Equality Makes Sense. It's not only the right thing, it's also benefits the whole society to have a more gender equal society. And this is something that most people in Sweden has understood, and that's why the feminist foreign policy has been accepted, and the feminist government generally has been accepted, and most people are supporting it and working along it. And about the Philippines, it's difficult to give any good answer spontaneously to this, but I can't see why it would not work here in the Philippines. As I said, you have a long tradition of working for human rights and gender equality in this country, and you would see the same benefits of having a feminist foreign policy and a feminist government that we do. Maybe there are some cultural differences that would make it more difficult. It's hard for me to say. So that would be another question I would ask you instead, whether a feminist government is plausible in this country in the next 10, 15 years. Thank you.
Yeah, you asked me about cultural barriers. If you look at this crowd today, there's more women here. I don't see a manifestation of barriers here. But if you look at even in education today, it's the girls that really pursue education. If you look at statistics, primary, high school, university, I think what the Philippines needs is to educate the men. To educate the men, and it's not just the women that should be reading the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. I think it should be the men reading it. The men should read the Magna Carta for women. The men should read the human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights. I am part of a group that's sending back dropouts from primary school. In our studies, we have sent back 500,000 young kids to school. The girls go back to school. The men stop somewhere. So I think in the Philippines, if you look at statistics, the men should be better exposed to what people think of as cultural differences. I don't really think there are such big cultural differences. Can somebody give me an example? On the whole, I look at the numbers of the kids that we have helped to send back, to keep them from dropping out. You know, our dropout rate in primary school is so high, you cannot believe it. And for 5 years, I've been working on zero dropout program, and I see that it's the girls, even if the parents want to send the boys to school, in the end, it's the girl who says, I go back. She's more interested to go back. I don't know why. Is that a cultural thing? I don't know. But if we look at the statistics, a lot of the kids that go back who would have dropped out were girls. If you look at high school graduates, more are girls. Now if you look at universities, girls. So perhaps the men should catch up. That may be one suggestion I have, that men should start looking at why are the women doing well in the country. True. I mean, if you are the only Asian country that's in the top 10 World Economic Forum that has addressed the gender gap, we have been there since 2006. We went from number 5, number 6, number 7. This is the lowest we get. I don't know why. There must be a reason. In terms of a cabinet, I remember serving in a cabinet where 40% were women. The finance secretary was a woman, DNR secretary was a woman, foreign minister was a woman, who else was a woman then? And these were the major cabinet members. This was the time when I was Secretary of Foreign Affairs. I don't know, you said there was only one. Now I think there are two, tourism and education. So, yeah. What culture, I'm curious, what cultural difference were you thinking of?
I'm thinking about religion. I'm thinking of religion.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about tribal cultures. I'm thinking about
Tribal
familial
cultures. I tell you, the women in the Cordilleras are tougher than the men. They send the men to war while they manage the community. You look at the studies on the Cordillera cultures. The Cordillera women are terrific. And they do a lot of, they are multitasked. You know, okay, they send the men to battle perhaps, but multitasking, bringing up the children, going to the fields, cooking the food, bearing the children, I tell you, they're terrific. I don't know other tribes, but I am more familiar with the Cordilleras that I think we can learn a lot from.
Somewhat about religion.
Sorry?
Religion.
So it's not just the Philippines that has religious differences. Muslim religion has, what, 5 or 8% now? I may be wrong. Or 10%, Claro? I think if you look at I don't think there are very big differences. One should look at where you will converge in terms of respecting the women, in terms of respecting nature, etc. There are many convergences that you will find. Perhaps there should, I keep encouraging our Muslim brothers and sisters to take the Foreign Service exam so that they can share with you how well do you know their culture. How well do people in Luzon know about the culture of the South. I think these, to me, are the challenges of Filipinos, to know ourselves better and to know our neighborhood better. Just as because I'm in the private sector, we did a wonderful comparative study of women in ASEAN. Of course, Filipino women are doing well, but we're not doing as well as the Vietnamese or the Thai women who are more aggressive in terms of economic freedom, of economic activities. So I think I would suggest very strongly that we study ourselves. Who are we? Who are our neighbors in the South? How many of us understand our Aita women? How I'm working with Aita women, that's why I'm very keen on that, and my Cordillera women. And I found them terrific. They're the multitaskers, and they are the achievers. And so I think Foreign Service officers have a responsibility to learn a lot more about our own people and look for convergences in the different groups that we have.
I'd like to comment briefly on Ed's remark about, or question about religion, since here I really see a big difference between Sweden and the Philippines. In my country, we are mostly non-believing Protestants, whereas here the vast majority are believing Catholics plus others. And what I have learned here is that the Catholic Church is it's against at least part of the reproductive health law, implementation of that law, against abortion, against divorce. and these are areas where we have made what we call a lot of progress in my country, and we believe that that has helped gender equality. So here I definitely see a difference in culture between my country and the Philippines. And maybe also another cultural difference is that I sense a little bit more of a macho culture in this country than in my country. I mean, here you hear politicians brag about their girlfriends and so on, and that would never happen in my country. So maybe that's also one difference which would make a feminist government or feminist foreign policy a little bit more difficult to implement here.
Yes, sir.
Ambassador Albert, I'm standing here to respond to your challenge. I'll give you one visual aid. To your left, take a look at those pictures. Those were the first directors of FSI from 1976 to around 1995. First 20 years. How many were women? Just that fantastic lady. The next 20 years of FSI, on your right, look at them. How many women? Many more than there are men. Times change, and this hall is proof to that. The last two batches of foreign service officers, those that went through and became my wards as cadets of VFA, the 2016 batch, 29 got appointed by the president. 2017, 29 also exactly got appointed by the president. Last year, of the 29 new foreign service officers, 12 were men. Many more women. The year before, 2016, of the 29 appointed by the president, 9 were men. So, in the very near future, maybe in less than 2 decades, maybe in between 12, 15 years from now, you won't have 49% of the officers running the international affairs of this country will be women. No, not 49%, maybe 67%, 2 out of 3. That's where it's heading, and that's what the statistics show. But you know, Ambassador Albert was the most inimitable mover of the very special question of whether women make better diplomats. She invited 5 fantastic women, and all 5 women were given each 7 minutes to answer that very simple question. Because it's so simple, because the answer is incontestable, it's indubitable. I mean, it has to be an absolute yes. But each of the 5 women diplomats, all of them retired from the service now, 2 or 3 took double the time they were given to answer the simple question. One or two, more than triple the time they were allowed. And you know, in my very humble understanding, the absolute yes answer should have been crystal clear from the start. But then again, related to the question, it can be expected for them to take longer, to talk longer, because after all, diplomacy is all talk. So how can women not be better diplomats? Okay, but, okay. I have been a Foreign Service officer nearly 30 years. But I have been a husband nearly 40 years. And I have always known that women do not just make better diplomats, they actually make better persons. And my wife is the first to prove. My wife wouldn't stand by and sit at home, you know, cooking and cleaning the house. No, she would want to be more than an equal partner to me. She would want to be in class and learning. She would want to be in the workplace earning. And because I am feminist ambassador of Freeze, she had that freedom precisely because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the forward moving thing to do. But because she also works, and therefore she tires, when she works and she says she's tired, I lose. When she tires, therefore she can cook, it's fine, because when she cooks, I lose. But because she tires and she doesn't cook, and she has to relax and have fun, so she goes shopping and I lose. But time is changing really. My first boss in the DFA was my batchmate. I joined the service 5 years after I passed FSO. And she was, what I heard, she was, and she's good, I know. She had always been good. But she was the best and the very first to have work read from cover to cover, from volume 1 to volume 3 of the briefing paper prepared for the president. President Cory Aquino, the first woman president, read the work of this woman director of China division. And it's just marvelous everywhere. This year, I told you about 2016, 2017 FSA batches. This year, 45 very young people took the test. How, guess, and maybe I can give you 50 pesos if you guess correctly. Of those 45, what gender was represented more? This is a feminist department of foreign affairs. We believe in women, we follow women, we say yes to women.
So I think that is a fitting end to our forum. I regret to inform you all that we no longer have any time, so I will be ending things here.